I'm here to talk just a little bit about the foundation I'm a part of and mostly about DAOs. And in particular, for those who might be more familiar with DAOs, maybe looking at them in a different lens than you've looked at before, perhaps in a much more meaningful way. And though for those of you who are unfamiliar with DAOs, maybe a little bit of a soft dip into the water. So the first thing that I really want to talk about here as we frame it is that I believe that DAOs equal hope. Now, who here is actually familiar with what a DAO is? Okay, all right. So that said, for those familiar with DAOs, this is always a fun question, and one that I find usually does not have the same answer is, what is a DAO?
Decentralized.
Yeah, I guess.
Means there is not just it's distributed. The ownership is distributed democratically, and people who have equity in that can vote to move or the rules or set the rules and the objectives for the organization.
Yeah, I would say that is very similar to mine, or at least probably is extremely similar because it includes all of those. Now, that said, a DAO, as it's Dan, right? Okay, yeah, see, I thought so. But so as Dan said, a DAO is a decentralized autonomous organization, which really doesn't sound like it means anything. It's kind of gobbledygook, like most of the crypto buzzwords are. Now, that said, what it really means is that you have a group that doesn't have the same kind of hierarchy that you normally see in an organization. There's less of a pyramid, although there can be some, depending on the DAO, and it can take different shapes. But as much as possible, the DAO tends to be spread evenly, or at least the possibility tends to be spread evenly for responsibility and for ownership. So whereas in Web3, to kind of give a definition of that, is the evolution of Web2 in that you own whatever you build on the internet. So it's Web 1 was read, Web 2 read, write, Web 3 read, write, own. A DAO is much of the same evolution of an organization. So not only are you able to contribute to something, but you're able to have a say in what that thing might look like. And that could be in the form of, okay, what does the governance look like? Whenever we set rules, what should those rules look like? Whenever we have economic systems, like incentive structures, what should those incentive structures look like? And over time, this process, although can be very messy because it requires extreme democracy, and for those who've ever been involved with the DAO, and I hope all of you will find one and become involved with one, know that you have to talk about everything. Why is the organization set up the way that it's set up? Is this the best way to do it for all of the members? Is this the best way to do it for the organization? And what it does is if you have a DAO, you're able to reimagine everything that's happened before, any type of organization. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go, what that actually means. Now, the reason why I wanted to start with DAOs equal hope is because this entire crypto revolution, I think sometimes is getting swept away by, in my mind, what it was supposed to be and turning into perhaps a financial opportunity. For those who are unfamiliar, this was embedded on the Coinbase of the Genesis block, so of Bitcoin. So whenever Bitcoin started, well, I guess, does anybody have feelings about that time in history, 2008, 2009? What was that like?
It's crappy.
It was crappy, right? At that point in time, for those who might have quickly forgotten, I think it's easy for all of us to forget and to just move on with our lives because that was 14 years ago now. We were at a point where we were wondering whether or not the banking system would survive or should survive. There was a point in where, you had these financial instruments that were just made up for the purpose of making money, which had no other utility whatsoever, and created this giant house of cards where they were packaging up these mortgage-backed securities that to try to say that you have distributed risk. And long story short, they created this entire ecosystem that was only for them, the banks did, to strip all this money out of the economy, from real places to put it into their pockets. And whenever the whole thing fell apart, and with it, came a lot of people's lives, their livelihoods, we were wondering what was next. And that's whenever Bitcoin came about. And so whenever Bitcoin on the Genesis block said the Times, January 3rd, 2009, Chancellor on brink of second bailout for banks, we were all wondering what place should banks have in the world? What place should governments have in bailing out banks? What should that structure look like? Now, here we are years later going through the exact same things, and nothing has changed. Nothing's changed. If anything, it's worse, because what happened is those bailouts happened, and now these financial instruments have gotten ever more complex to the point where they're now distributed not even at a bank level, but at a central bank level. We're now playing these crazy games and printing money and creating all these different instruments, and it seems like it's spiraling out of control. Now, that's not what Bitcoin was built for. Bitcoin wasn't meant to be this instrument where it goes from 9 cents to $90,000. That's a byproduct of its value. The value was supposed to be that it gave us another way to imagine what banking would look like if we owned the bank, or if it couldn't be manipulated by those who owned us. And so Bitcoin coming forward allowed Web3 to be born, because before that point, even though these ideas were actually brought up in the 90s, and depending on how you look at it, you could even argue that wisps of the idea were as far back as the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Bitcoin coming about allowed for Web3 to actually come into the global being. And what that was, Web3, we kind of talked about that, is this is Gavin Wood, who's the co-founder of Ethereum. This is his definition of Web3. It's a decentralized online ecosystem based on the blockchain. Once again, doesn't really mean much, but what that means is if you have a blockchain is just a bunch of distributed computers working towards something. We own those computers in theory as people. And if we can create an online ecosystem that we own, then we can build applications on top of that we also own. And that's really where DAOs come to be as well. So then the DAOs reemerge. For those who, once again, aren't familiar with DAOs, this came back in the 90s. So this isn't a new idea. They're originally referred as DACs, which are decentralized autonomous corporations. But corporation doesn't sound as flashy whenever you're trying to build some kind of new infrastructure. But nonetheless, they're actually a lot more closely resembling those nowadays as DAOs are beginning to incorporate. For those more familiar with DAOs, you might be interested to kick up a conversation afterwards about what incorporation looks like for a DAO, what types of jurisdictions allow you to do that, what the rules are surrounding that, and also to where that's at in the process. Now, that said, who cares? Like, why would you care about a DAO? Why would you care about any of this kind of stuff? Well, what a DAO does is it allows us to have new ways to collaborate, innovate, and solve problems like never before in history. I was just hoping that wasn't me. I double-checked my do not disturb before I went on here.
I totally forgot. It's election day, so I'm getting 50 calls to go out.
No worries.
I've never heard of.
Yeah, no worries. We'll make sure to vote. Vote crypto. Yeah. Yeah, you can. You should. So DAOs, this was actually something that it seems a little weird for me to quote myself here, but I wasn't the only one speaking whenever this came up the last time. But the DAOs allow us to experiment with new economic and governance models without fighting a war to do so. This was something that came up on a podcast that I had last year, and it really seemed to stick with people, is that never before in history, I want you to think about this. Never before in history could you go, you know what? I've got a great idea for how you might run a government. Let's get together, let's build it, let's test it out and see what happens. You couldn't do that. What you do is you go, okay, I've got this great idea for how to run a government. Let's get together, let's overthrow this other government. If we're still alive whenever it's all said and done, let's see what happens in 20, 30 years. Now, this is a completely unprecedented time because not only can you do that, we can, by the end of this afternoon, probably start 5 DAOs. We can get together and we go, you know what? This is something I care about, believe in. This is a great way I think we could organize around something and manage each other in a better way. Let's test it out. We have 5 different models just in this room alone. Now, why is that meaningful? Well, imagine if the whole world is doing this. Imagine if you look throughout the course of human history, you think about the different types of governance models, how many there were. There weren't a lot, considering how many thousands of years we've been trying to form governments. But live time, right now, there's an experiment going on where as many forms of government have ever existed, there's that many and more that are being tested as we speak. And it's done in a transparent way where we can all see it and we can all learn from it, which means that I can look at your DAO and you can look at my DAO and go, you know what, that governance model really didn't work. People got stuck here. They got into debating back and forth about what to do, and nobody actually followed through with anything. So we need to test this model out a little bit. And not only can we look back and forth and learn from one another, but we don't have to worry about getting overthrown if we change, if we adapt. We can just continue to adapt and adapt and adapt and adapt. Whereas if you think about the United States government, for instance, I personally am a big advocate for the American government, not necessarily how it's always operated, but how it was designed to operate. And in that way, even if I wanted to change something or I thought that it was perfect or whatever it might be, I recognize that you can't really, to move this giant ship would be incredibly difficult and probably darn near impossible without some type of sacrifice or loss. Now, it might be financial loss, it might be human loss, but you can't just go, you know what, let's go back to the Constitution. I want a little bit of column A, a little bit of column B, a little bit of column C. Let's get rid of column D, F, G, and let's test this out live. Boom. Now, I'm not saying that you should, because a government of that size is completely different than an organization of thousands of people or tens of thousands of people. But you couldn't do it, so therefore you couldn't figure these things out. But now you can, and you can do the same thing with economics. You kind of go, okay, what do we think we value as a species? Like, what do we care about? Well, let's attach a financial value to that, or at least attach an asset value. We can, as a DAO, come up with an idea that go, you know what, if you do something meaningful, we want to give you tokens for that, because that's what we care about. That's what we believe in. And in doing so, if there's a secondary market where these tokens or NFTs or whatever crypto asset it is has some kind of financial value out in the world, hey, great. And if not, at least between each other, we know that those tokens have value, and we can use those to determine how we work with each other towards other types of a shared vision. So in that way, we've never been in this point before. If you want to experiment with something, try something, now's the time to do it. You've never had this chance. Like, this truly is. Everybody wants to think that they're at this point in history that has never been there before, because we all think we're special, right? And we know we're truly not whenever we actually look at it. But I think in this moment, we actually are. I think this is the moment where whenever you look back 100 years from now, 500 years from now, 1,000 years from now, that's the moment where, if we're still around, we're going to look at this and we're going to go, that's the moment where they tried a lot of things out. They figured out what was working, what wasn't, righted the ship, and off they went. Or they'll look at that and go, that was the moment they didn't. And here we are. My gas mask is my best friend, because whenever I take it off, I die. But either way, this is our shot. Now, this is really important too. So not only is the banking system highly reminiscent, in fact, I think worse than it ever was, crypto is becoming just banking system 2.0. So for those who are unfamiliar with the crypto space, I'm going to give a quick update to where we're at. You might have heard maybe in the news some of the stuff about Three Arrows Capital or Celsius or any of those kinds of things. Essentially what they are is they're large pools of funds being used to make money off of, and then they buy leverage positions. For those who don't know, there are 1,900 cryptocurrency hedge funds that all appear to use heavy leverage. And for those who are unfamiliar with leverage, you can actually leverage in some cases 10, 100, 125 times leverage on trades. And what that means is that you are exposing yourself to a level of risk that allows you to not only wipe out what you have, but beyond what you have. And this is being done as a financial instrument that sounds a lot like what the banking system does, is they create all these derivative markets and leverage markets, and crypto is just another asset for it. And we know 1,900, or at least that's what's estimated, so that are trading at high volumes with small amounts of collateral. that doesn't sound like the kind of financial revolution that I was hoping for. Now, that said, this doesn't have to be a permanent, but this is a present. Now, for those who, and this was first done a month ago, and I wanted to kind of do this as an introductory to kind of why we matter, and maybe months from now, whenever we actually talk more about the DOI Foundation. We have since recovered a little bit from this crash, but at the time, this weeks ago, we lost $2 trillion, and that's just in market value. Now, that is nothing. I want to pause on that for a second. Think about that with banks. Whenever, if you were to say, hey, there's this much money taken out of the stock market. Well, oh yeah, please.
Just a quick question. When did this crypto crash happen? Because I wasn't aware of it.
Oh, just like 5 weeks ago.
Oh.
Yeah. So
when the Terra Luna and all
yeah.
that kind of came out.
Yeah. Bitcoin got down to 17,980 or something like that. And compared to, 65,000. So it's kind of like,
okay, I got you.
Yeah. But that said, for those that have been around long enough, it's kind of still been like this, because it wasn't that long ago. I mean, even 2018, you're buying Ether for 70 some odd bucks, and 2015, even less, and so on and so forth. And having been around long enough, it's nice to see. But still, nonetheless, you had a $3 trillion market cap and then just boom, down to 1, 2/3 of the value. But that's just the market cap, though. What people don't think about is crypto derivatives. So what happens is a derivative is basically, it's like a game that banks play, that cryptocurrency firms play, that people can play, that we can all play, where it's kind of like a bet. You kind of say, okay, I think that the horse with the green saddle is going to win, and I'm going to put this much money into that. Now, that's separate than market value. What that is money coming into a market where I'm betting on the horse with the green saddle to win. And if I lose money. And if I win money. And there are people that take these bets in the background and go, okay, all right, we got 3 times here for the green saddle, got 3 times here for the green saddle, got 5 times for the red saddle, 5 times for the red saddle. Like, this is going on live time right now. And it has for years with the banking industry. Like, this isn't a new instrument. They call those derivatives. So a derivative meaning it's derivative of another financial instrument. So you can do the same thing and do the same kind of game playing around Amazon stock. Well, what that means is that there's a ton of money coming in to crypto derivatives and other types of interesting financial instruments that money was lost as well too. What that true value is, who knows? Like, they talk about that with the derivatives market, what's the value of the derivatives market? They don't know. Outside of crypto, it's quadrillion, they guess, dollars, US dollars. It's a number so astronomical you can't even wrap your head around it. But it's real money. It's real lives. It's real resources. And crypto business operations. So for all of those who actually operated in crypto, trying to build something of value, a lot of that was lost as well too. A lot of people were laid off. You might have seen that, Coinbase, et cetera. Of course, Binance has been sweeping them up. But at the same time, there's a lot lost there. What I wanted to really make talk about here briefly before we get into what DAOs can do is I think the crash was the best thing possible for crypto. I do. And actually, if I have a choice, and I know that this is going to be a little bit controversial, I hope it crashes further, harder, and for longer. But I also have a different goal.
So, I'm with you on that, because then we can easily get right back in.
Yeah, we can get right back in, and it also changes what we're trying to get right back into. What happened is crypto became so hot that people were aping in to, quote unquote, into anything they could get their hands on. Having been part of a crypto startup myself, I was seeing that ridiculous things people were buying, ridiculous things like 300,000% APY. And they were buying that. They're like, okay, you can't have 300,000% APY. The math doesn't work out. The only way to give that kind of yield is if you create that value to where you can it's like a loan. Say, if I pay you 15% back next year, I have to make 18%. Well, actually, I have to make 25% because I had to make the cost of the loan plus the risk plus the operations to reinvest into my company and give you 15. So if you're saying 300,000% APY, it's bullcrap. It's just all this fictional stuff where it's worth it because you think it's worth it and has no other real utility whatsoever. Now, Another thing that I really, really, really hate, and I want to change the record on, is no FUD. I hate no FUD. Whenever somebody says no FUD, no FUD, no FUD, what they're telling you to do is shut up and not ask questions. Imagine FUD being fear, uncertainty, and doubt. Like that's a crypto thing where if you go into a group and you're like, hey, you know, what's the real value of this coin? And they're like, don't talk about it, no FUD. And you're like, imagine if you walk down the street and police officers had shirts that said no FUD. You're like, all right, I guess then I shouldn't ask any questions then. Whatever happens, happens, and it's clearly for the best. Like, that's the exact opposite. Fear, uncertainty, and doubt means that you don't have clarity what the real value is on this project, and that's the time to talk about it. To either find out it doesn't have value, or to create it, or to discover it. So, furthermore, meme coins, I get it. They were valued at some point in time, and you might, like, I get it. I've got some Shiba or whatever, you know. But crypto isn't about an endless stream of meme coins. And for those who have been in crypto long enough, especially the last couple of years, I mean, you've got thousands and thousands and thousands of meaningless coins that just got, especially like of 10,000 different variations of the Shiba Inu dog and Elon Musk combined together. Sometimes some Dragon Ball Z, you know, some got like different versions of all these little things, and creating meaningless coins that are valuable just because people think that they are. Well, they shouldn't be. Like maybe we keep one Dogecoin or whatever, or 2 or 3 or whatever, 10, but come on, we can't do like 100 or 1,000. We need to move past that. We need to start using crypto for what it was intended. We need to use it to actually redesign our society. So at least that is my opinion. So to that, I'm not going to spend too much time rattling into us, because this isn't really we just are a player in this much larger picture. And at the end of the day, I hope that we all are in this room, and anybody who might listen to this and beyond, a player in this much larger picture of kind of making this meaningful. Now, the DOI Foundation Declaration of Inclusion Foundation was built to make sure that Web3 was impactful, ethical, and sustainable. So one, that it actually matters, that what we're doing actually matters, because if it doesn't matter, why do it? We've got a limited amount of time. We've got a limited amount of money. Why waste your life doing something that doesn't matter when you have a choice to do something that does? And of course, that it's ethical, that it's designed in a way that actually is, you know, mindful of what other people are going through, what other cultures believe, what other, you know, because we don't all have the same belief systems, but being mindful that no matter what it is, it's done in a way that we can all agree is beautiful and representative of us, inclusive, etc. And sustainable. And now why sustainable? If I were to start a charity and I say, hey, I want to create world peace, and I want to do it in a way that doesn't involve a totalitarian one world government, because that's usually the way that most governments create world peace, is through control. But if I were going to try to create world peace and some kind of mechanism that was actually, you know, ethical, but I said that it's a really, really great idea. I'm going to need $10 million, $10 billion, $10 trillion, whatever amount of money it is. And the moment the money's gone, the operations are done. Do you think I'm going to succeed? No. And these projects are doing that all the time. They're like, hey, here's the scoop. We don't have anything built, but you give us $100 million and we're going to build it. And better yet, once we build it, we've got no business operations. We've got no way of creating recurring revenue. There is no long-term perspective on how we're going to make this project continue to work, but give us money. It's like, no, like before you ask for the money, you should have something built. And whenever you get the money, you should have a clear way to yield more back into it, even if it's impact related, especially if it's impact related. Because if what you're doing, like if you had a charity that could not only provide, or nonprofit or DAO that could provide clean water initiatives to people, and the amount of revenue coming in was greater than the amount of revenue coming out, that meant that you could continue to give clean water to people in perpetuity. Now, if you can only do it so long as you're fundraising, then at some point in time, the funds are going to dry up and clean water initiatives go away. Clean water dries up, the tap is dry. So in that way, we knew that this is something that we were called to do. In fact, actually, because we started doing something else and realized that this was the bigger problem. So our goal is to be the head, heart, and voice of a meaningful Web3. Head, we're in the process of creating the assessment systems for which people will understand whether or not something's impactful and to grade it and to compare it. And that is an open source initiative where we're going to be one of contributors above and beyond the projects that themselves will self-report. Also, a team of researchers worldwide will be able to contribute to this open source initiative to understand what impact is. Heart supporting the initiatives through us and also a collective of other people who care about the same things that we do in the DAO space and beyond. And Voice. We have a podcast. We join other people's podcasts. We also have a network of social media influencers, and we talk about things that matter in the crypto space. Now, that said, we talked about the strategy, but moving on. Why do we think DAOs equal hope? Well, 21% of Americans trust politicians. Now, I was actually surprised to see it was that high. But it's still not a very good number, even if it's higher than I thought. 64% of Americans live paycheck to paycheck. 31% of the world is unbanked. 1 in 5 children live in extreme poverty. Now, keep in mind, extreme poverty is different than poverty. Extreme poverty is like starving to death, dirt floors, no access to medical care, drinking water that's filled with insect larvae. Extreme poverty, 1 in 5. 28% of Americans are unfulfilled at work. That's not surprising. But then whenever you add that to 300 million jobs expected to be lost due to AI, like in the near term future, like not 2100, you add an unfulfilled workforce, barely surviving, some people really not surviving, and this clear, and by the way, that's offset for the amount of jobs being created. So that's after you factor in the jobs that will be created for it and then take out the jobs that will be taken away. So you have the situation here where we're, as a society, we're looking at each other. We clearly don't, that this isn't working for us financially, from a meaningful perspective. And we're now looking at the edge of a cliff, a near-term cliff, and we've got a choice. Like, we can just kind of keep on doing it, BAU, business as usual, do nothing. Or we can actually try to step in, and we can't boil the ocean, of course. There's no way to just change everything, but you can do something. You as an individual can go somewhere and do something and do it in a way where you financially can afford to do it, which is where DAOs come in. These are just a short list of things I know DAOs could help with. Now, does that mean solve? Not alone and not a single DAO, but they absolutely could help. And the more people that were inside of that space collaborating collectively, the more I believe that you could actually solve these things. So a handful of these things would be personal data, dealing with what should artificial intelligence or machine learning look like for us? Like, what is that foundational framework? We can collectively organize that, own those things, have a say on what that looks like. Of course, it can help with inflation, it can help with the loss of meaning. We're not going to have Social Security for those of us who are, 20, 30 years out. Of course, it can help with wealth and power gaps, equal rights, a metaverse. So what I mean by this is for Facebook, who became Meta, this is a metaverse owned by Facebook. So if you are worried about a metaverse, so basically a place where you think we might actually spend a lot of our time contributing to society in our work or interacting with others in the social space, this metaverse, that's basically the internet where you can also kind of see each other too, put another way. Although the metaverse will soon enough be on Apple glasses. We're actually not that far out of that, at least in a small form. But that's about to be owned by Facebook. Now, Facebook, if something is free, you're the product. Pause on that for a second. Like, they are monetizing you. They're monetizing who you know, what you like, what you say, where you go, and they're tracking all of it. Now, if you don't want the metaverse, which is now not only where you're going to hang out on social media, but where you're also going to then work and spend more time in a meaningful way, if you don't want Facebook to own that, or you don't like that model, then you can have a say. You can try to create a DAO and then reorganize what a metaverse might look like. And then hopefully if people see that governance structure and they see those economic models and it's sustainable, they might choose that. And same thing with lobbying. I've been having a lot of conversations about Lobby DAO or Lobby 3. If you want to have, because clearly lobbying has to exist because the senator doesn't know what a senator doesn't know. And they couldn't possibly have the time to educate themselves on everything. Well, how do they learn about information? By educated, well-informed people coming to them and taking the time to present those things to them in its best form. Now, lobbying could also be like the, I forget exactly what, I think Chile, one of the South American countries is presidential candidate who you might have seen in the news. Pfizer got a yacht full of like bikini clad women partying and all that kind of stuff like that, like prior to the election, clearly lobbying for their best interest. And you kind of, if you look at that and you go, wait a second, I don't want that. I do want a voice, but I do also, because we need to have a voice, whether it's about crypto initiatives or otherwise, but I want to have a say in what lobbying looks like. I don't want it to be a yacht full of, bikini clad women. I want it to be, meaningful education, relevant to actual initiatives. I want to, perhaps maybe with bills, you want to lobby for bills not have 2,300 pages or whatever it might be. Whatever it is that you care about, lobbying could help you figure those things out in the real world with lawmakers where it actually matters. Because these rules will affect us regardless of how we feel about them or whether or not we want to disengage from the system. A DAO could allow you to create a lobby pool where we can all collectively put funds together and agree on how things want to work. For education, echo chambers, et cetera, so on and so forth. Now, that said, I want to pause for a second and re-engage everybody who is listening to this, because this really isn't a rant about what I think or feel, other than me just presenting the information as a Kickstarter. This is a short list of things I thought of. Is there anything that perhaps you might want to ask a question to me, say, hey, how might we solve this problem? Or for that matter, just pick one of these things on this list and go, hey, Cory, you're crazy. How in the world can you tackle addiction with a DAO? Or I can't say tackle, that'd be the wrong term. How could you begin to contribute towards the problem of it? Is there anything that you might care about that you'd be really curious how one might create a DAO? And maybe even, depending on what it is, I might be able to tell you a DAO that's working on it.
Addiction.
Now, yes, addiction is clearly among the harder ones, which is the reason why I mentioned it. So we talked about this on our podcast. And so we do live podcasts. We stream them through Discord, Facebook, and Clapper. And then so we do them live. So we interact with the community live in Discord, and then we communicate it live, Facebook, Clapper. And then they're also on Apple, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Podbean, Google, I think, a couple others. So that said, this was one that came up in a podcast. Now, addiction is hard because there isn't one root cause. So what you have to do is you have to pick a couple different root causes. So there is the physical side of addiction. So the physical side of addiction is, something that's almost the easiest to solve, because in theory, right, if you had an infinite amount of money, because you could identify what it is chemically that's happening to make people addicted to something. And you could, for instance, see they have Lab DAO, which is a collective of people, researchers who share lab equipment, kind of like the Airbnb for lab equipment. You could work to collectively, a team of researchers and Lab DAO and equipment to work towards that. You could also use crowdfunded cures, which is although not a DAO, they are a Web3 project, which I absolutely love, where you could identify off-patent drugs, and you could create a DAO to kind of support them in this. Use off-patent drugs that have been found to help with addiction, that bring them to low cost, because once it goes off a patent cliff, you can't help people anymore with it. The drug companies won't use it, even if it's found effective. But biochemically, you could solve that problem. That's a lot easier than saying, okay, how do the underlying causes of, let's say, mental health. So mental health is probably a much larger factor in addiction, and for all of us, for that matter. And so the question is where does mental health come from? I think that mental health comes from, assuming for those of us who can ever receive mental health, because there are some of us who can never get it just because of the way we're wired. But I think many of us, most of us, can get it if we feel like we have a sense of purpose, meaning that we matter, that we belong here, that we feel like we contribute. We feel like if we were to leave this earth, that someone would care. and we have a clear place where we can do that thing and provide that value. So we feel it and we act it. Now, in that way, addiction comes a lot of times whenever people feel they lose touch of the fact that they matter, or they lose touch of some ability to actually have impact in a meaningful way. Now, if you can start with that, then that makes a dent in the rest. And also, too, then you can use other pre-existing programs that have been shown to help, like collectively in community, to help with addiction for people that now have a sense of purpose and now have an ecosystem for which they can contribute in to now help other people dealing with addiction with other methods that we know. And you can create a DAO around it where the efforts that they create refuel the treasury. So it continues to refund this. And as they learn and make mistakes, because 99 out of 100 things are going to be wrong. But every time they learn the 1 out of 100, we choose to fund into this to buy those tokens, not to just buy some meme coin, but to buy those tokens to fund that pool. And they choose to operate in a way where whenever they're contributing back to society, there's also some kind of financial ability to replenish the treasury. So they can continue to test this out. And sure, it starts small and imperfect, but over time it continues to build, because that's the DAO we're putting our financial instruments into, our power into, our leverage into. So any others?
What about the nutrition of food? Like, how exactly would that work?
Oh gosh. So I am really huge into soil quality. And there's also, speaking of DAOs, there is a DAO called the Ken DAO, K-I-N, like Ken next to Ken.
Not the Ken doll.
No, not the Ken. No, the Ken, K-I-N DAO. Yeah. Although that would be a very interesting way to get marketing attention. Maybe could be a good meme coin for sure. But Ken DAO focuses on soil quality. And whenever you think about nutrition in your food, what most don't recognize is whenever you think about a plant, you think about the sunlight is the energy, right? You think about the water, which allows for these chemical processes, but what's actually building the plant? Like, what's it made out of? It's made out of the soil. Like, just like what you're made out of. You think, like, what are you made out of? You're made out of the things that you shove into you. So if you're a plant and your building blocks, the things that you contain or don't contain, are made out of the soil for which you sit. And there are soil issues where the nutrients have been stripped out, or the biodiversity has been killed by pesticides because we thought it was great to keep the bugs off the top. But what we didn't realize is there was this giant ecosystem supporting the health of the plants below that created enzymes that need to exist in order for the plant to create the same kind of outcomes that they did previously. We're killing all those bacteria and fungus, which are clearly part of a larger ecosystem. And we wonder why our food is less and less and less nutritious, which it is. And not only is the food itself, like a banana, less nutritious than, well, banana's a whole different story because of genetic engineering, but let's say an orange, far less nutritious than it used to be 200 years ago, like orange for orange. I've heard said gurus say it's like you have to eat 6 or 7 oranges. I mean, don't quote me on that one, but to get the same nutrition as one. But you think about, like, from hundreds of years ago, you think, okay, not only is the food itself less nutritious, gram for gram, pound for pound, but we're also choosing, because we're struggling to survive, to create more and more and more processed, nutrient deficient food. So you have a soil quality issue, and then you have a cost of living issue simultaneously existing, where you can't just, like, I can't go buy clean, healthy food and afford to live at the same time unless I'm making $150,000 a year. Like, you just can't. Like, try to go to the grocery store and go, I'm going to buy only healthy stuff that I don't have to spend 2 hours making every single night. So one of the couple things that has to change. Either A, you need to have more time to make food that's healthy, plus also have nutrient-dense food. Or B, if we don't have the time in our lives to do that, then we need to have nutrient-dense food that's packaged in a way that we can consume on the go. Now, you could create a DAO like the Ken DAO around the soil, or you could create some kind of larger initiative DAO about having fast, healthy foods and thinking about what that looks like, and maybe even going, okay, what are the nutrients that we're missing in our diets? How do we build around that? Is there a corporation in the Web 2 space or outside of Web 3 space that's already doing something like this, that if we brought more resources to them, could make it much more affordable. And then you could pick one product and start there. You could token raise, you could have a couple hundred people or even 20 people that start this DAO and maybe just go to Kashi and say, hey, what would happen if we took this one subset of food that you really can't afford to market and spend all this money for, and we could add in these nutrient densities and make it actually still palatable and enjoyable, and would you be able to bring the cost down here, here, or here? So you tie into existing resources, and you could do that with the DAO. Any other one? Yeah.
I had a question. So
Yeah.
What's the goal? Like, what's the mission of the DOI Foundation? What do you guys are going to do for the community? Are you going to help startups? Like, what's the mission?
Yeah. So I don't know if you got a chance to see this one before, but the idea is that I believe that people are good, generally good, by and large. I believe that whenever most of us wake up in the morning, we don't think we're the villain to the story. We think we're the hero, or at least doing our best part. And if that's the case, if people are generally mostly good, then we want to make a difference. We want the world to be a better place. We want people to be happy and healthy, as best whatever that means, however we can. We just don't have the ways to do it. So we get confused, we get overwhelmed, and then we just live our lives. It's not easy for us to define how we can survive and support the people we care about, and also do it in a way where everything that we're doing is impactful. Now, if we understood that, especially in a place where like Web3, where you've got this new financial ecosystem that now exists, if we understood, hey, we can contribute to a DAO or some other kind of Web3 project, we can be very meaningful to ourselves and to humanity, and we can also receive financial compensation that allows us to survive, then I think we're likely to do that as opposed to not doing that. The issues is that one, we haven't identified what those things are, and the conversation is complicated and convoluted. And two, we don't really know where to go, where to actually allocate those resources, which is our time and or our money. Now, if we knew that, so if we had a clear place, let's say the DOIFoundation.com, to go and say, these are the impactful projects in the Web3 space. Here's how they're impactful, like why they matter. Here's how I can contribute and how I can also receive compensation back. And here's research on what the impact actually is, because it's one thing to say it's impactful, but over time to be able to collect collectively as an open source database, the research of like how it's impactful, what are the secondary and tertiary impacts that may be good or bad, to understand what that means over time. I can better align, okay, if I can only choose, and this is something for which I'm writing a grant proposal on right now and using this as a story. If I had a magic lamp, I only get 3 wishes. And I chose to make those wishes for everyone else. And I could only choose 3 wishes. How would I determine what the best 3 wishes would be? Because once the 3 wishes are wished, they're gone. Well, I need to have some clarification on what actually matters the most. What's the most impactful use of my wish? And if you have that in the Web3 space and a way to define that, and then to go, oh, it also aligns with my values and the things that I care about, and it's clearly identified what it needs on the website or things that I can contribute, and the compensation is in line with what I need to survive, I think we can change the world.
So basically, you want to, in layman's terms, you want to be a crunch base for Web3 projects, where people that want to participate / invest or help these projects can go to this website, they can research, they can see if it aligns with their values, their goals, and if it meets so, then there should be some call to action there. And basically is that?
Yeah, I would say Crunchbase plus impact. So if it doesn't impact, it doesn't matter. At least not to me. I've only got one life. I've only got so much time. I'm not going to spend it on things that aren't going to contribute to the problems that I care about. I've got a family. And so if I can choose one over the other, I'm going to choose impact all day. And so to that extent, it's not just Crunchbase, because there's a lot of great projects, like for instance, Dowel HQ, fantastic project by by the way. Lucas and Emmett, the founders, amazing, super sharp. And you should definitely, if you don't know what DAO HQ is, you should check it out. You should use it. Now, that said, they've got an aggregate of DAOs that talks about financial data and allows you to research things, buy governance tokens, etc. Awesome project. Where DAO HQ could use the DOI, and I'm sure in the very near future will, is, okay, they can gauge financial instruments. We're here to gauge impact. We're here to really understand what is impactful. Is it really impactful? Do you think it's impactful and it's really not? Because you can do something and think that it matters and create negative consequences. Or you can do something, not think that it doesn't matter a lot and find out it matters tremendously. Like something as simple as the analogy is like a babysitter. Like if a single mom can get a babysitter to go to college and then she gets an education, what does the impact of that really? You might think, oh, a babysitter, certain amount of cost allows her to be able to have that spare time. Well, the babysitter might actually be able to contribute to the moral and the well-being of the child, give structure the child wouldn't have normally had. The education might allow the mother to get into a different, not only financial bracket, but a different environment, which could then give the kid a different school system and different peers, which could then also give the kid a different mindset on what humanity is, where they fit, what they do, and then keep them from getting into crime, which then means the areas for which if you have less crime, then you've got a better viewpoint of what police are doing, because with less crime, they're now spending more time actually protecting and serving, so on and so on and so on and so on and so forth. And this babysitter becomes this massive avalanche of impact that doesn't seem like on the surface that it is. And there isn't anywhere that's really calculating that. The closest thing that's trying that is GiveWell in the Web2 space, is the kind of like the most impact for your dollar. GiveWell is awesome. And actually the grant is to Open Philanthropy, which is a subset of GiveWell. So the one that I'm talking about, the Magic Lamp story. In that way, that's the closest thing I'd say to what we're doing, is kind of like if you took GiveWell plus Crunchbase, layered them over each other. And then instead of GiveWell being in a funnel, because GiveWell, all of GiveWell's research is in and of itself, which means that their biases, whether they're cultural or otherwise, or just life experiences, things that they've seen, things that they haven't seen, those will translate into what they determine as being impactful or not. But if you open it up and say, this is a public good, we can all collectively work through worldwide what is impactful, why it's impactful, contribute to that research, look at the historical data, then that changes everything. Because now we have real clarity in what impact looks like and real clarity in what the impact of your time and money looks like.
Another question.
Yeah.
How do you determine if a project is impactful enough for the DOI Foundation to actually spend resources and time to investigate, like if this is going to be impactful? How do you go about that?
Well, that's the hardest question of all. And that's the question that gets back to like what GiveWell is working on as well. And you
balance the benefits against the harms.
Yeah, I would say that's definitely a good way. So the harms we talk about, that's consequence scanning. So what we do is we look at something, okay, is there negative consequences to whatever it is you're doing? Because, the old saying, the road to hell is paved in good intentions. It's like there are some times where you think you're doing something good and then there's negative consequences. So you have to factor in for that, for sure. And so that was a brilliant answer. In that way, you also just go, okay, start simple, meme coin or nutrient density in soil. And then you get like, obviously the extremes, right? No value whatsoever, or like as a nutrient density in soil, or like, for instance, like a crowdfunded cures. You've got, because we cover all Web3 items, DAOs or otherwise. So you've got crowdfunded cures, which is helping to bring off-patent drugs that have been either known to or believed to provide actual value, maybe even save human lives that are off patent and they're no longer available to humanity. Okay, well, clearly one's better than the other. Now, where it gets difficult is the shades of gray between. And that's where you have dialogue and you have to say, okay, is it impactful if a clean water initiative? I think most people would think that it is. And so you have your basic needs like food, water, shelter, to feel like you have a sense of purpose, like what you do matters, because if you don't feel like that, you're going to destroy the society around you, yourself, and also people you care about. And You also want to make sure that the system itself, so talk about things that matter, is like the governance system. So if you created that'd be a complicated one. If you created a governance model that allowed to protected, let's say you created a model that even if AI were to compound it 1 million times over, that it still wouldn't become at some point in time self-consuming. Because is that meaningful? You might argue that it is. You might also argue that it doesn't solve immediate term needs right now. How would you compare that to actually giving food to somebody as opposed to some potential, maybe might happen 30 years from now, AI situation where it's just like eating itself because we programmed it to make the best trades, and then eventually it makes the best trades faster and faster and faster and faster and destroys the stock market. Like how do you compare those things? So right now, short answer, just dialogue. You have to start somewhere, and that's also why it's open source, is because you create a framework of what we call VBM, value-based minimums, the things that meet our values minimally. And then from there, we open it up to the rest of the world to decide, because no one person could possibly do that alone.
I'd like to address one of the harms.
Yeah.
I claim that derivatives are harm. The derivatives are basically unethical because they, while they're a fun game, they're not a product or a service. They're a method of gambling. So how do you prevent your DAO from degenerating into derivatives?
Now that's a hard question. I'll give it the best crack.
You don't have to answer.
Yeah,
it,
no,
but,
no.
I want to address it.
Yeah, I love hard questions. In fact, that's actually my preferred. I prefer that you all think about the hardest possible question you've imagined and then throw it at me. So now that said, how might you handle that? So you can't control what happens in the secondary market. That becomes outside of your control. You create a DAO, you have a governance token or a council token or whatever you might want to call it. And then what happens after that is outside of your control. Now, what you can do is you can clearly identify that it doesn't have, you could set taxes for one. I'm not saying that necessarily like taxes like whenever it's bought or sold. You could also I'd say taxes would probably be the biggest one. You could also just as a community not support it explicitly, which means that it would be hard for anybody who actually cares about the values to in any meaningful way purchase those governance tokens, or it would be clearly identify the us and them, those who are using it for good and those who are not. And in that way, you could have social incentives where you blacklisted certain wallets that used it in that kind of way from entering into voting, let's say. So you could see, like, say, you could set up rules that says if you enter derivatives markets and it's found out, that we're going to blacklist your wallet for voting. So you can't, because you can have token gated voting. So if you own the token, you can get into gate to vote. And you just say those people can't do that because it's out of line with the value systems there. Now, of course, that creates its own set of problems. It's like, who are you to judge? Exactly.
You sit in the middle. That's what it comes down to. I mean, the whole decentralized aspect is you build the service and you just let people run. And if they make the bad choice, then the DAO is going to end up voting on the outcome. So being in the middle kind of reverts back to being Web 2, where it defeats the entire purpose of the project. So.
Now, that said, and we've had that conversation a lot on our podcast and beyond, and still have yet to have a clear picture or answer on it. Talking about being fully decentralized or just shades of decentralization, just like shades of DAO. For those who are more familiar with DAOs, there's like shades of DAO, like they're like, how decentralized are you? What's the hierarchy look like, et cetera? There's not a clear answer. But if you are fully decentralized, that means that you can't tell your grandma to go in there. Because if your grandma goes in there and somebody steals all of her money, even right in front of her, and then just goes, whatever, like that's not a system you let your grandma go into, or mom or sister or daughter or whatever it might be. Somebody you care about you're not going to want them in that system. So vice versa, that system allows for maximum flexibility for people who are willing to take on that risk as well. So that pool, that kind of like extreme risk, open Wild West type setup is actually necessary whenever you're trying to test the bounds, what new laws might be, or what new rules might be, but it's not for everyone. So on the opposite side, you also have shades of different levels of risk and understanding. You also want a system that is not corrupted, can be as resilient from tyranny as possible, that still allows for distributed ownership. Now, that isn't fully decentralized because you have to set up rules, you have to set up regulations, you want laws, you have to have laws, whether or not you feel like you want them or not, in the real world in order to create defensibility. And also, governments aren't going to accept you not having any laws. So my best answer so far to that is basically recognizing where you're at on that to the ecosystem that you're building, and just being really clear about what ecosystem that is. If you're the fully decentralized Wild Wild West, there needs to be the warning label that says, hey, this is tornado cash. Your money is going to get stolen at least 5 times before you figure out how to use this program. Like, so, and if you're willing to do that and you think that the reward outweighs the risk, then go for it. But vice versa, like, hey, you may not have the same kind of potential for crazy APYs and all that kind of stuff like that, or ability to build things outside the bounds of current laws over here, but you can recommend a coworker there. That's probably the best for them, and just shades of gray between. And DAOs have to, and this is the beautiful thing about a DAO, is that I may not have the answer, or even no matter what my answer is, I'm wrong. I had this epiphany, and I think it's probably one maybe we've all had, or at least hopefully you have it now. If you look through history, not a single person was right throughout the entire course of human history, ever. Not Newton, not Einstein, not any of them. They were approaching being right, maybe. We'll find later they got closer and closer and closer to truth, or better and better understandings of kind of where their situation was and what their perspective was, but they were never 100% correct. And we need to have the same humility with ourselves. No matter what I say, 100, 200, 500 years from now, somebody's going to look back at this video and be like, fool. Like, and with having having the hindsight of everything that has yet to happen. So in that way, DAOs, the way that DAOs are meaningful is that it requires a kind of discourse, the kind of discussion, the dialogue that says, okay, above and beyond, what I think, or not saying that that's a hard, steadfast rule, how do we grapple with a problem like that? And how do we accept what level of decentralization we are, and whether or not that steps outside the bounds? And collectively, we figure that out, and then we learn we're wrong again, and then we collectively figure out from our mistakes, and we keep doing that until eventually we've got the better iteration.
As far as as far as a DAO, can you talk a little bit about the funding situation? Is it always going to be like yourself? You started a DAO. Are you the central, the banker, so to speak, in that ecosystem?
So as far as being the banker in the ecosystem, we ourselves are trying to really fit the niche of facilitating impact, and by assessing it and then understanding what those impactful projects need, and then letting the ecosystem support them. Now, what might be a good facilitator of funds, for instance, is Movement DAO. Movement DAO was actually on our podcast, and I was also on the Movement DAO podcast as well. Movement DAO is really great because if you're looking for an impactful project, like a DAO, they might help fund you. So they have, I don't know exactly what their raise is up to now, $16 or $17 million. They just recently kicked off, and they now have a pool of funds to fund meaningful DAOs. And there are others like them. So for instance, talking about the Ken DAO, they started Primordia DAO, which is a subsidiary of the Ken DAO, which they do the same thing. Well, not the Ken DAO, again, K-I-N DAO. So the Ken DAO does the same concept. Is they go, okay, if we see an impactful project, how do we support them? How do we consult them? How do we fund them? And there's a lot of different players in this space, each with their own particular niche. Our niche isn't funding. So that actually is where it started. Actually, we started thinking that we were going to be a funder, and then realized that there was this giant hole where nobody really had any clear picture on impact, and everybody was focused on meme coins. It was actually where we started, and then we pivoted to that exact point.
So it's a new organizational philosophy for a venture fund.
Yes. Yeah.
That's cool.
Yeah. It is. It very much so is. I think you got your hand.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, like with DAOs giving everybody the ability to participate and the discourse, like you said, what if people don't?
Yeah.
I think Dan said there's an election today. Like, I didn't even know. That's like, people don't vote. Like, local election turnout directly impacts them. It's non-existent. What if, they're gonna watch TikTok instead of getting the DAO chat.
Yeah. So that actually happens a lot.
Or like even I bet like right now, like what are the biggest DAOs? What's their wallet holder rate to like voting participation rate? It's got to be minuscule.
It is.
Yeah.
Yeah, because right now I would argue that we're on the awareness side of the spectrum where people are just becoming aware at a very small percentage that this can even be impactful and what contribution could look like. I was actually having this conversation just yesterday. I think DAOs in general are at a point where they're not all working with money. And I guess to put that another way, they don't have clear incentive structures for people to contribute financially. And so it makes them hard. People who are interested in DAOs right now are bouncing between DAOs, like a lot of DAOs. So they'll go into this Discord or that Discord or whatever it might be. And they're not really staying anywhere for too long, not because they don't care, but because maybe they're DAO curious. They're so maybe they're DAO curious and they're just wanting to bounce between these different things and they've got a day job. Maybe they are already in the space, but they've got a main impact project or two that they're a part of. And they can only designate so much time. So they jump into something, they jump into a few chats, but then there's no way to keep them in financially and they bounce. So that's a big problem that's happening right now. We think that as DAOs become a more common financial structure, organizational structure, and it's also represented in real world value, like you actually are incorporated in different places, then you can start paying people. It'll be easier to get people who actively contribute. And then of course, on top of that, you go, okay, what about non-employee type contributions? One of the things we've been playing around with is what we call impact to earn. It's like where you designate what it is that you're doing that's meaningful and you assign a bounty to it. And if voting happens to be one of those things, then you of course have to be careful. Okay, are they voting because they care about the cause? How do you discern that it's that they actually care and not just that they're trying to like Axie Infinity, like game the system and make a bunch of tokens or whatever, but they actually care about things. So that creates its own set of issues. But at the same time, there clearly needs to be in the short term some kind of incentive structure around voting in a way where that you know that they're actually contributing with their vote and not just doing it for the incentive. And that's a problem. That's a problem that needs to be solved and nobody has a clear answer to yet.
What are so like you could be like an impact DAO aggregator and you said DAO HQ. Was that the one that has a bunch of projects and stuff? Like,
yeah.
What are the tools that are available for? I would guess that a lot of people in here own a token that would allow them to vote in something, right?
Yes.
Like how can I like track that?
Yeah.
DAO HQ.
Go to DAO HQ.
Cool.
DAO HQ is awesome. For sure.
Does anybody in here own a token that allows them to vote on something?
Well, we might not even know.
That's what I'm asking. Who's in it? You guys do?
Yeah, I mean, I vote on Snapshot, it's gasless, so we use one like Polygon. So yeah, you can use the free, you don't have to pay gas. That was my question. How do you feel about gasless voting, like having a stake in the game? Because if there's no stake to pay gas, then your voting power becomes kind of unlimited if you have a lot of tokens. And if you're sitting in a specific like threshold of like token holders. So like, how do you feel about that?
Gosh. So to that question and voting in general is such a complicated answer that once again, we're still working through. So you want voting to matter and you also don't want the say of the few to outweigh the say of the many. In theory, I mean, sometimes if you're an investment DAO, you do, because like if you, for instance, have a lot of money in it, you don't want somebody with, one token, what we call one wallet, one vote. You may not want one wallet, one vote if you've got 45 million tokens and somebody else has one and you're trying to determine the best use. And it's just truly about making money to determine the best use of funds because a person with one token probably doesn't have the same vested interest. Or clearly, it doesn't appear that they have the same financial understanding you might with the circumstances of situation, just having been present longer and putting more money into it. So the opposite end is, of one wallet, one vote is basically is completely skewed to however many tokens that you hold. Now the in between here and there is like quadratic voting, like where you have like tokens that basically exponentially, they go down in voting power. So that's one thing that you can do. You could also do weighted voting. Meaning that you create certain weights to certain types of votes. And you can also create, where you basically you have to stake, if you will, Like you talk about like gas, you basically have to stake something. You have to put something up. You have to say, hey, I care so much about this that I'm willing to put this on the line. I think that all of those are right for different situations, and probably all of those situations and more. There's even more mechanisms than that for voting. I think that a single DAO might have to employ many of them. And I think that right now, whatever we're testing, we're going to find out is wrong. The question isn't whether or not it's wrong, it's to what level of correct was it, or what worked and what didn't, and we'll just have to adapt. We originally started as one wallet, one vote, and now that we're moving over to this assessment model, we're considering whether or not that would be the same. And we recognize that we still need to have one wallet, one vote in many cases, because we had 127,000 people sign up for the airdrop. And we, even with the pivot over towards an assessment model, recognize that they came in thinking that they would have a say, and they should. But perhaps, on operations type stuff, people who are far more versed with what's going on should be the ones to have a better say. So to that point, I think you just have to figure out, okay, what's actually most likely to get this outcome and make your best hypothesis after much dialogue amongst the group.
I have two more questions.
Yeah.
So for market makers, if you're a market maker and you have a pool, whether it's staking or yielding, how do you recommend for that person to utilize DAO? What's the best way to engineer and build a DAO for market makers to get people incentivized or get them to be more active in your pool and things like that?
Well, one clear thing is if you are a market maker, you want people to see value in the token and the whatever instrument that it is that you're making the market with. If you were part of a campaign to help people understand the value, that would probably be meaningful. I would say the first thing I would do if I were in that position, I would go and reach out to the founding team. Because of the crash, we're at a point in time now where you might actually be able to talk to many of the founding team and ask them, okay, as a market maker, what's your roadmap? I'm fully in financially, as you can see, because obviously it's all on the chain. I'm fully in. I want to make this thing succeed. What do you have on your roadmap? And they go, well, we're going to do this with social media influencers. We're doing this with this content campaign. We're doing this here. And then you try to fill in the blanks and figure out how much money it's worth for you to do it, or give advice, or be able to connect them to the things that they need to achieve that. That's what I would do. But perhaps my perspective is just a tad bit different, thinking about it from the founder side. If I had somebody come to me and say, hey, look, I aped in and bought $4 million worth of this token, and I want to make sure that I can set up a pool and that there's value in that. How do we get this thing to the other side? I would clearly lay out the roadmap and do everything I could to help collaboratively for the shared interest get it to the other side. That's what I would do. And
my second question is, when you're issuing tokens, right, for airdropping, or you have your own DAO, obviously the community's main investment is to get in and be participating in this project. But you mentioned the secondary market, and with the SEC regulation coming down, what are your thoughts on my DAO tokens, my DAO voting card? Now I want to go on OpenSea or Wearable or any of these marketplaces and want to trade or sell my position to someone else in the community. What are your thoughts on regulation coming down?
Yes. So regulation is huge. As you see there, lobbying is something that I've been spending a lot of time thinking about, talking about. I think simple answer to regulation is that you must have utility, specifically in the ownership. If you can't argue utility, you're a security. Now, the question is okay, where does something with utility still become a security? I think as of current, although the laws aren't clear, utility becomes a security whenever you present it as a way to make money. Like if they can go back and show evidence that the founding team said, hey, buy this here, it's going to the moon, even if it's a utility token, even if it's a governance token, one would have a strong argument that it was presented as a security. And quite frankly, I think that that's a legitimate argument. Now, what I tend to communicate is, well, first off, what we communicate, first and foremost, what we believe and what's true is that there very well could be no value whatsoever. And quite frankly, I would be much happier if there was no value whatsoever in holding a DOI Foundation coin. The reason being is because then I know its holders care about what's actually happening and they find their value from the impact. Now, if there happens to be a secondary market, it wasn't by my design. The worldwide community decided that being able to be a part of that and be able to vote on impact matters. And it has a financial correlation to what that impact matters. It has nothing to do with me. Now, if somebody says that, hey, I want some of those voting tokens because I want to vote on that, because I want to be a part of this, cool. But that's not the designation. It never has been, it never will be. And so at any given point in time, if somebody's listening to this video or looking at any Discords or any of our Telegram stuff or any of the Twitter, they're not going to see at any given point in time where I said, to the moon. Now that said, there will be a point in time further down the line where there'll be, I'm sure, talking about regulation, where even that may or may not be enough. And probably there should be some form of simple, easy to do, not clearly designed to be a moat to keep people out. So, but there should be regulations where you can define what you have a certain way with the jurisdictions for which you're operating. There should be forms you could fill out for that, a way to ensure that, you know, it doesn't get mislabeled one way or the other. And if it does, even better, I think in a perfect world, what I'd really love to see is for securities to become deregulated, to not fully, but in a way where we can trade these things back and forth. And as long as things are not done in a fraudulent manner, and it's not done in a way that is harmful to people, that would be a good system. That would be, and instead of having to have all these weird laws on whether or not it is or isn't a security, what can or can't I say, to set the laws around here's how I can operate or not with my security token in order for it to be above board or not. That would be much better for a government to do. But that's my 2 cents.
Can you tell us what your bio is briefly?
Oh, yeah. So my bio is, I can't say not at all crypto because it seems weird, right? If you've been in crypto for 6 years, you're like some kind of vet at this point. It's like 6 years, all grizzled and gray beard. But yeah, so I've been in crypto for a while now, but this vision I've had actually was far before crypto. It's something that I've been writing about ever since I was a kid. There was never an instrument for which to actually follow through with it. There was never this capacity to change the course of fate, to have an impact on humanity, society, etc. So I took the course that most people did, and I tried to, I took the course that some people do, and then I fought everything. So if any of you have ever seen Fight Club, my childhood looked like, the scene at the end with all the buildings blowing up. It's just, I wanted to watch it all burn down because, that was the angry stage. You look at it all and you're just angry because you see it. In fact, actually, I drew this tattoo whenever I was a kid, and the eye represented the ability to see the world around me, to perceive it all, take it all in. And the tears represented that ignorance was bliss, and that it just to be able to wipe it all clear. I'm not that same angsty kid at all, for the record. But it started that way. And, that's kind of where I went through. Of course, through that time, I started my first business at 9. Selling products door to door in a catalog, and then taking orders, and I take the money and facilitate them. And then I always had a hard work ethic. My last business, whenever I was able to finally get to this point, I sold in December 2020. It was a construction business out in Denver. And throughout that entire journey, I never lost sight of this. And of course, stayed engaged in crypto. There was a version of this project that I got 99% of the way to launch, but then my other business in Denver got in the way and I didn't launch it, but it's always been top of mind. Now it has very much changed to me being of a hopeful state. I no longer believe that it all needs to be burned down. I see that 90% of what we do is beautiful and meaningful. The infrastructure does not need to be unraveled and thrown apart. It's just, there's a few key things that the good people, and I even believe politicians want to believe they're good, if they had different systems, if they had different support to do the things that they want to do, that we could reimagine these things and solve these problems without having to drop a bomb on it all. And quite the opposite. Dropping a bomb on it, historically speaking, never works. All it does is create a lot of suffering and loss and then chaos, and whether economic or actual life. And fortunately, we're at the point in time now where that whole thesis that I've always had that you can have a revolution that governments want, meaning that they're happy about because all of their interests are in mind. It doesn't decouple it doesn't destroy their system. It doesn't unravel their financial ecosystem. They make more money than ever, and everybody's contributing even more to a society and happier about it. That can exist. So did that kind of answer your question, or was it one?
Yeah, definitely. A little background is nice, you know. You definitely sound like you know what you're talking about. So I always am interested. Okay, how did you get to that point?
Yeah, I would say and I think that's actually a good thing that just got brought up. If you're getting into this for the first time, how do you get to this point? If you care about something, you'll get to this point a lot faster than you think. Because it's one thing to just like get into crypto and be like, oh, I'm going to make a bunch of money or whatever, YOLO. It's another thing to say, okay, this is actually very meaningful. It affects me in real life. You know, I've got, a family member with cancer, and I see that there are off-patent drugs that could help her in her treatments, and that kind of thing. If you see that, you're going to learn faster. You're going to dive deeper. You're going to find those people, and whenever you have conversations with them, there are tons of people out there that, like myself and others, that are in the space already and deep in, and happy to have a conversation with you. Now, if you're going to come to me and talk about some meme coin or something like that, and that's the extent of the conversation, I don't have time for it. I'm not saying that dismissively like I'm better than it. I just don't have time for that. But I think that's good to know, because everybody feels like they're behind the 8 ball. Where we're at right now, like, you are probably still ahead of the curve. Like, all this stuff with DAOs that I'm talking about is still pretty much 4, 5, 6 years out from actually really changing the infrastructure of things. There will be a lot of steps in between here and there, but if you were to jump in today and didn't know anything about DAOs, heck, if you were to jump in 2 years from now, I bet you could still really have a meaningful say in where things end up. So that said, I didn't want to take up the entire time with my presentation, although I'm happy the questions were awesome. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. I'm also going to put Jeff up here because I don't know if he's still on or not.
I like how you got the puzzle piece embedded in the DOI.
Yeah. The missing piece. Yeah.
Are you completely done? I'm supposed to get in touch
Yes.
with Jeff.
Like specific
Everything
issues,
wrong.
perhaps they have 100,000.
Oh,
I
no.
do Telegram a lot, actually, is what I do these days. Are you on Telegram Discord?
Yeah, not the Telegram much, but get messages. Is there a thing I can do for like scanning?
Yeah.
Jeff Wade said that we should meet, so I was going to try to set something up for you. With you.
Yeah.